The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the ocean miles away. The county courthouse stood as a monolith of pale stone in heavy columns, a temple of civilian law that had weathered decades of local dramas, petty grievances, and shattered lives. The wide, concrete steps leading up to the grand entrance were worn smooth in the center, a testament to the thousands of reluctant feet that had climbed them. Margaret Abernathy took those steps one at a time. She was a woman in her late 60s, though age had not bowed her. Her posture was a masterclass in alignment, her spine straight as a plumb line, her shoulders squared with a quiet, unconscious discipline. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat, unyielding twist, framing a face that was weathered not just by time, but by elements and experiences most people could not begin to fathom. There were deep lines around her eyes, carved by years of squinting into the blinding sun of foreign deserts and the harsh glare of operating room lights. She wore a simple, tailored charcoal suit. It was unassuming, respectable, the kind of attire that blended into the solemn background of a legal proceeding. But resting just below the collar of her white blouse, resting against her chest with a weight that defied its physical mass, was a ribbon of pale blue silk. It was speckled with 13 white stars, holding a 5-pointed star of solid gold, an anchor at its center, surrounded by a laurel wreath. It was the Medal of Honor. Margaret did not wear it for vanity. She wore it because today she was standing for someone else, and she knew the silent power of the ghost that walked with her. Waiting for her at the top of the steps, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a nervous horse, was Elias Thorne. He was young, painfully young, barely out of his teenage years. He wore his navy dress blues, the fabric immaculate, the creases sharp enough to cut paper. But the uniform could not hide the trembling in his hands or the wide, terrified look in his eyes. Elias was a good sailor. Margaret knew this. She volunteered at the local Veterans and Active Duty Support Center, a quiet place where she poured coffee and offered the kind of unspoken understanding that only came from having worn the cloth of the nation. Elias had made a mistake, a severe lapse in judgment born of panic. His young wife had gone into premature labor, and Elias had driven through town at reckless, dangerous speeds to get to the hospital. No one was hurt, thank God, and his baby daughter was now breathing safely in a neonatal incubator. But the law was the law. The reckless driving charge was severe. For a young sailor trying to secure a clearance and build a career, a conviction of this magnitude, coupled with a massive fine he could not pay and potential jail time, would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. It would mean a dishonorable discharge. It would mean the end of his life before it truly began. Margaret reached the top of the steps and stopped beside him. She did not speak immediately. She let her presence settle over him, a calm, immovable anchor in the storm of his anxiety. "Ma'am," Elias said, his voice cracking slightly. His knuckles were white as he clutched his service cap. "I do not know how to thank you for coming. You did not have to do this." Margaret turned her head, her pale gray eyes meeting his. Her voice was low, resonant, carrying the rhythm of a slow, steady heartbeat. "We do not leave our own behind, Elias. Breathe." She did not offer hollow reassurances. She did not tell him everything would be all right, because the world was a chaotic, unforgiving place, and she knew better than to make promises she could not control. But she was here. That was the promise. They walked through the heavy glass doors, passing through the security checkpoint. The metal detectors hummed. The security guards, tired men in ill-fitting uniforms, barely looked up, though one older guard paused, his eyes snagging on the blue ribbon at Margaret's neck. He blinked, a flicker of recognition passing over his face, and he unconsciously stood a little straighter as she walked by. Courtroom 4B was located on the second floor, down a long hallway paneled in dark, varnished oak. The air inside the courthouse smelled of floor wax, old paper, and stale sweat. It was the smell of anxiety. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with an institutional silence. The wooden pews in the gallery were scarred by the fingernails of anxious families. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, irritating frequency. At a small desk to the right of the judge's elevated bench sat the court clerk, Thaddeus Winslow. Thaddeus was a man in his late 70s, his shoulders stooped under the weight of a lifetime of bureaucratic monotony. He wore a faded cardigan over a rumpled shirt. His fingers, knobby with arthritis, sorted through the day's docket with mechanical precision. Thaddeus was a veteran of a different era, a man who had stood watch in the freezing rains of the Cold War. He lived a quiet, invisible life now, organizing the tragic, the petty, and the profound failures of the citizens of his county. Thaddeus looked up as Margaret and Elias entered. His tired eyes swept over the nervous young sailor, recognizing the look of a boy whose entire future hung by a thread. Then his gaze shifted to the woman walking beside him. Thaddeus's hands stopped moving. The file he was holding slipped slightly against the desk. He saw the silver hair. He saw the immaculate posture. And then he saw the ribbon, the pale blue, the 13 stars. Thaddeus felt a sudden, sharp coldness wash over his chest, followed by a profound, heavy heat. He knew what that was. He had never seen one in person. He had only seen them in history books, in grainy photographs of grim-faced men standing in the rose garden. To see it here, in this shabby, forgotten courtroom, resting against the collar of a quiet older woman, felt like witnessing a ghost stepping out of the fog. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, a deep, ingrained reverence forcing him to sit up straighter in his chair. A sharp buzzer sounded, cutting through the low murmur of the room. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The bailiff was a large, imposing man, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. The Honorable Silas Hawthorne presiding. From the heavy wooden door behind the bench, Judge Silas Hawthorne emerged. He did not walk, he processed. Hawthorne was a man in his late 50s, born into a family where wealth and influence were as natural as the air they breathed. He had the polished, well-fed look of a man who had never known a day of physical labor or true existential fear. His black robe billowed slightly around his ankles. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. His face was set in a permanent expression of mild disgust, as if the very air of the courtroom, breathed by the common people, was offensive to his senses. Silas Hawthorne viewed his courtroom not as a place of justice, but as his personal kingdom. He was obsessed with decorum, with submission. He demanded absolute obedience, viewing any deviation from his strict, arbitrary rules as a personal insult. He had never served in the military. He had spent his youth in elite universities and private clubs, shielded from the dirt and blood of the world. To him, the military was an abstract concept, a lower class of people who did the unpleasant jobs so men like him could sleep peacefully. Hawthorne took his seat behind the elevated mahogany bench. He adjusted his heavy, gold-rimmed glasses and looked out over the room. He did not see people. He saw subjects. He saw inconveniences. "Be seated," Hawthorne commanded, his voice a sharp, aristocratic bark. The gallery sat. The sound of wood groaning under weight filled the room. Hawthorne opened the heavy leather binder in front of him. He did not look at the clerk. He simply extended a hand. "Call the first case. State of California versus Elias Thorne," Thaddeus called out, his voice a little shakier than usual. He could not stop his eyes from darting toward the gallery, toward the woman sitting perfectly still in the second row. Elias stood up. His legs felt like lead. He walked to the defense table, standing at attention, his hands locked behind his back. Margaret rose smoothly and stepped forward, taking a position just behind the low wooden bar that separated the gallery from the well of the court. She did not cross the bar, respecting the physical boundaries of the room, but she stood close enough to be a tangible presence behind the young sailor. Hawthorne looked down over his glasses. He took in the sight of the young man in uniform. He frowned. He disliked uniforms in his court. They felt like an attempt to garner unearned sympathy. "Mr. Thorne," Hawthorne began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you are charged with reckless driving, speeds exceeding 90 miles per hour in a residential zone. This is not a minor infraction. This is a profound disregard for the safety of the public." "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice trembling but respectful, "my wife, she went into early labor. The doctor said the baby was in distress. I panicked. I just wanted to get her to the hospital. I deeply regret my actions, sir." Hawthorne sighed, an exaggerated theatrical sound of exhaustion. "Every criminal has a sad story, Mr. Thorne. Every lawbreaker believes their personal emergency exempts them from the rules that govern the rest of civilized society. It does not." Hawthorne shifted his gaze from Elias to the woman standing behind the bar. He looked at Margaret. He saw an older woman. He saw the plain suit. And then his eyes locked onto the flash of gold and blue at her neck. Hawthorne's brow furrowed. He felt a sudden, irrational spike of irritation. This was his sanctuary of law. He demanded austerity. He despised flashy jewelry, viewing it as a distraction, an affront to the somber nature of his authority. He did not look closely at the metal. He did not recognize the design. His arrogant mind simply processed it as a gaudy, inappropriate bauble. "Ma'am," Hawthorne said, his voice cutting through the silence like a razor. Margaret looked up, her gray eyes locking onto his. She did not flinch. She did not blink. "Yes, Your Honor." Hawthorne pointed a manicured finger at her. "This courtroom is a place of serious legal proceeding. It is not a theater. It is not a social club. I demand strict adherence to a professional dress code. That oversized piece of costume jewelry you are wearing is highly inappropriate and distracting. Remove it immediately." The silence that followed the judge's command was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a thunderclap. At the clerk's desk, Thaddeus stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face. He stared at the judge in sheer, unadulterated horror. Did he just call it costume jewelry? Thaddeus felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. He wanted to speak. He wanted to leap up and scream at the judge to stop, to look at what he was pointing at. But 30 years of subservience to the bench kept him frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard his joints ached. Elias turned around, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at Margaret, entirely unsure of what was happening. Margaret did not move. Her hands remained resting lightly on the wooden railing before her. Her expression did not change. There was no flash of anger, no indignation. Her face was a mask of supreme, practiced stoicism. She had faced down warlords in the dusty, blood-soaked valleys of the Middle East. She had held the torn arteries of dying boys in the back of violently shaking helicopters while incoming fire tore through the fuselage. The petty, arrogant demands of a sheltered man in a black robe were nothing to her. She understood instantly that Hawthorne was ignorant. But ignorance of this magnitude, wielded with such arrogance, was a dangerous weapon. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice even, devoid of any emotional inflection. "With all due respect to the court, this is not jewelry. It is authorized. I will not remove it." The words were spoken quietly, but they echoed off the walls. Hawthorne's face flushed dark red. His hands slammed down on the desk. "Authorized? Authorized by whom? I am the ultimate authority in this room. You do not dictate what is appropriate in my court. You will remove that necklace, or you will be removed from this building." The bailiff, a heavy-set man who had spent 20 years in law enforcement, took a step toward Margaret. But as he looked at her, he hesitated. There was something in her eyes, something so incredibly heavy and immovable that his instincts screamed at him to stop. He looked closer at the metal. The gold gleamed under the harsh lights. He didn't know exactly what it was, but his gut told him it was something sacred. He stopped halfway down the aisle. Margaret kept her gaze locked on the judge. The ribbon around her neck felt suddenly heavy, pressing against her skin. It was not the weight of the metal, it was the weight of the memories. She did not speak. Her silence was a fortress. It enraged Hawthorne more than if she had screamed at him. He was a man who fed on submission, and the quiet, absolute defiance of this older woman was making a mockery of his power in front of a room full of people. Hawthorne's mind raced. He wanted to punish her. He wanted to break her composure. He realized that a direct attack on her was failing. She was unafraid of his bailiff. She was unafraid of his voice. So Silas Hawthorne did what cowards in power always do. He attacked the vulnerable. Hawthorne leaned back in his leather chair, a cruel, calculating smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He shifted his gaze from Margaret back to the terrified young sailor standing at the defense table. "Mr. Thorne," Hawthorne said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous purr, "it seems your moral support has a problem respecting the rule of law. And since you brought her into my courtroom, her behavior reflects directly upon your character." Elias's breath caught in his throat. "Your Honor, please. She is just here to help me. I am the one on trial." Hawthorne raised a hand, silencing him. "Reckless driving at 90 miles an hour. The maximum penalty includes a permanent revocation of your driver's license, a fine of $5,000, and 30 days in the county jail." Elias staggered backward half a step, as if he had been physically struck. 30 days in jail. It would mean missing his ship's deployment. It would mean a court-martial. It would mean a dishonorable discharge. His wife, his newborn baby, everything he had fought for, everything he dreamed of, was suddenly evaporating before his eyes. Hawthorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, steepling his fingers. He looked directly at Margaret, his eyes glittering with malice. "I am a reasonable man," Hawthorne said to Margaret. "I was prepared to show leniency to this young man, considering his circumstances. A simple fine in traffic school. But your blatant disrespect for this court forces me to reconsider his judgment. The company we keep speaks volumes about our respect for authority." Hawthorne paused, letting the threat hang in the heavy air. "Here is my ruling, ma'am. You will remove that gaudy piece of metal from your neck, right now, and apologize to this court. If you do, I will grant Mr. Thorne his leniency. If you refuse, I will throw the absolute maximum sentence at him. I will ruin his career today, and I will put it entirely on your conscience. The choice is yours." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Even the bailiff turned to look at the judge in shock. It was a blatant, unethical abuse of judicial power. It was extortion. At the clerk's desk, Thaddeus felt a wave of nausea. He gripped his pen until it snapped in his hands, ink bleeding onto the docket. He looked at Margaret. Margaret Abernathy stood perfectly still. The silence in the room became an oppressive physical weight. For the first time, Margaret looked away from the judge. She looked down at Elias. The young sailor was staring at her, tears pooling in his eyes. He was terrified. He was a boy facing the destruction of his life. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg her to take it off, perhaps to tell her not to. But no words came out. Margaret looked at him, and she did not see a sailor in a courtroom in California. For a fraction of a second, the polished wood and fluorescent lights vanished. She was thrust back into the searing heat of a desert canyon. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning diesel. The sound of heavy machine gun fire was a physical pressure against her eardrums. She saw the faces of the young men she had treated, boys just like Elias, boys who had trusted her to fix them when they were broken. She remembered the slick, coppery feel of blood on her hands as she packed a chest wound. She remembered the frantic, desperate rhythm of her own heart as she dragged the wounded Marine across 30 yards of open sand, the sand kicking up into her eyes as bullets chewed the earth around them. She remembered the young corporal who had bled to death in her arms while they waited for the medevac. He had been 19. He had held her hand, crying for his mother, until his eyes went blank. The medal around her neck was not a piece of jewelry. It was the physical manifestation of that day. It was forged from the blood of the boys who did not come home. It was the soul of the nation, pinned to her chest. To take it off under the threat of a petty tyrant was not just a personal insult. It was a desecration of the memory of those dead boys. It was spitting on the graves of the men who had died while she fought to keep them alive. Hawthorne thought he was clever. He thought he had trapped her. He assumed she would capitulate to save the boy, or she would stubbornly refuse, proving herself to be the selfish, arrogant disruptor he believed her to be. He did not understand the psychology of a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. He did not understand the concept of silent sacrifice. Margaret turned her gaze back to Hawthorne. Her eyes were no longer just gray. They were the color of storm clouds over an angry ocean. There was no hatred in her face. Hatred required an emotional investment she was not willing to give to this man. There was only a cold, terrifying pity. She made her choice. It was the only choice a warrior could make. She would not desecrate the honor of the fallen, and she would not let the boy be destroyed. She would draw the fire to herself. Margaret Abernathy did not reach for her collar. She did not argue the law. She did not attempt to educate the judge on what the medal was. She knew that words were useless against willful, arrogant ignorance. Instead, Margaret took a deliberate step back from the wooden railing. She brought her hands together in front of her waist. She crossed her wrists. She stood there, offering her hands to the court. "I will not remove it," Margaret said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it possessed a resonance that commanded the space. "If my presence offends the court, then the court must do what it feels is necessary to me, but you will leave the sailor out of it." Hawthorne stared at her, stunned. He had expected begging. He had expected rage. He had not expected absolute, unyielding martyrdom. Her calm acceptance of his threat, her willingness to sacrifice her own freedom to expose his cruelty, infuriated him beyond measure. His face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You think you can play games in my courtroom?" Hawthorne spat, his voice rising to a shout. "You think you are above the law? I find you in direct, willful contempt of this court." He slammed his gavel down so hard the wood splintered slightly. The crack echoed like a gunshot. "Bailiff!" Hawthorne roared. "Take this woman into custody immediately. Process her for contempt. She will sit in a holding cell until she learns respect for this institution." The bailiff swallowed hard. He looked at Margaret's crossed wrists. He felt a deep, sickening sense of wrongness, a betrayal of everything he believed his badge stood for. But he was a man who followed orders. He unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the room. He walked slowly toward Margaret. He stopped in front of her. He looked into her eyes, silently pleading for her to just take the necklace off, to end this madness. Margaret gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a nod of forgiveness. The bailiff reached out. He gently took her wrists. The cold steel of the handcuffs closed around her skin. The ratcheting sound, click, 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 was the only sound in the room. As the metal tightened, it pressed against the cuff of her blouse. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second. The sensation of being restrained, the cold metal, triggered a violent phantom memory. It felt like the pressure of a tourniquet she had once applied to her own bleeding leg while still returning fire. She forced her breathing to slow. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. It was the tactical breathing that had kept her sane when the world was ending around her. She would not give this judge the satisfaction of seeing her break. The bailiff placed a gentle hand on her elbow. "Ma'am, please come with me." Margaret opened her eyes. She did not look at the judge again. She turned her head and looked at Elias. The young sailor was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking, paralyzed by the enormity of what was happening. "Hold your head up, sailor," Margaret commanded quietly. Her voice was firm, pulling him out of his panic. "You have a daughter to go home to. She turned and began the long walk down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her back was straight. Her step was measured. The handcuffs gleamed dull silver against her dark suit. Resting above them, catching the harsh fluorescent light, the gold star on the blue ribbon swung gently against her chest. In the gallery, citizens sitting waiting for their cases stared in stunned silence. They didn't know the law, but human instinct told them they were witnessing a profound injustice. They parted ways as she walked past, some unconsciously pulling back their feet as if making way for royalty. Thaddeus Winslow watched her go. A tear, hot and bitter, spilled over his wrinkled cheek and dropped onto the legal pad in front of him. He looked at the arrogant man sitting high on the bench, casually rearranging his files as if he had just swatted a fly. Thaddeus felt a fire ignite in his chest. It was an old fire, the fire of a man who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom closed behind Margaret Abernathy with a solid, echoing thud. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence, but Thaddeus knew with absolute certainty that it was not the end of the story. It was merely the striking of a match in a room full of gasoline. The descent into the bowels of the county courthouse was a transition from the realm of arrogant theater into the cold, concrete reality of the penal system. The bailiff walked slightly ahead of Margaret Abernathy, his hand no longer gripping her elbow. He had released her the moment the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B closed behind them, ashamed of the steel cuffs binding the wrists of a woman whose calm demeanor made him feel like a trespasser in his own profession. The air grew steadily colder as they moved down the narrow, poorly lit stairwell. The scent of floor wax and old paper faded, replaced by the sharp, stinging odor of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and rusted iron. It was the smell of confinement. Margaret moved with measured precision. Her leather shoes clicked softly against the concrete steps, a steady rhythm that echoed off the cinder block walls. She did not stumble. She did not look back. The steel cuffs bit into her wrists with every movement, a cold, unyielding pressure, but she ignored the discomfort. Pain was merely a signal, information that the brain could choose to acknowledge or discard. She had learned to discard far worse. As they reached the basement level, a heavy steel door buzzed loudly and slid open, revealing the holding area. It was a bleak corridor lined with cages of thick steel mesh and reinforced glass. Inside, desperate men and women paced, slept on rigid metal benches, or stared blankly at the walls. The deputy on duty behind the processing desk looked up, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. He took in the sight of the elegant, older woman in the charcoal suit, her silver hair perfectly swept back, her wrists locked in irons. Then he saw the blue ribbon resting against her blouse. He stopped chewing. Even in the depths of the courthouse basement, the aura of the metal commanded a sudden, instinctive pause. The bailiff handed over the paperwork without a word, avoiding the deputy's eyes. The deputy processed her quietly, his movements unusually gentle as he removed her belt and shoelaces, the standard protocol for suicide prevention. He did not ask her to remove the metal. He did not know exactly what it was, but a deep, primal intuition warned him not to touch it. Margaret was escorted to cell block C, a solitary holding pen at the end of the corridor. The heavy door clanged shut, the sound of brutal finality that usually broke the spirit of first-time offenders. The deadbolt slid into place with a sickening thud. Margaret stood in the center of the small gray room. There was a stainless steel toilet in the corner and a narrow concrete slab jutting from the wall. The only light came from a caged bulb in the ceiling, casting harsh, elongated shadows. She walked to the concrete slab and sat down. She rested her hands on her lap, the chain between her wrists plinking softly. She closed her eyes. The silence in the cell was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. But Margaret did not hear the silence. For a warrior, sensory deprivation often acts as a doorway, ripping open the carefully constructed vaults of memory. As she sat in the chilling cold of the California basement, the gray walls dissolved. The temperature spiked. The sterile smell of bleach was instantly obliterated by the choking, sulfurous stench of high explosives and burning diesel. She was no longer Margaret Abernathy, a civilian standing in a courtroom. She was Senior Chief Abernathy, embedded with a Marine reconnaissance unit in a nameless, sun-scorched valley in the Middle East. The memory hit her with the physical force of a blast wave. The sky was not blue. It was a bruised, terrifying purple, choked with swirling sand and the black smoke of a burning Humvee. The ambient sound was a deafening, chaotic roar. The rhythmic, mechanical thumping of heavy machine gun fire tore through the canyon, echoing off the rock walls like the laughter of a mechanical demon. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the kinetic energy of supersonic lead snapping overhead. She was low-crawling behind a shattered mud brick wall. Her uniform was soaked in sweat and sand. The medical kit strapped to her back weighed 40 pounds, but she felt nothing but the adrenaline flooding her system. 30 yards away, pinned down in a dry riverbed, were 3 young Marines. They were cut off. They were bleeding, and the enemy was closing the noose. Margaret remembered the radio crackling in her earpiece, the frantic voice of the platoon commander calling for close air support that was too far away. She remembered looking at the open ground between her and the riverbed. It was a kill zone, a flat expanse of unforgiving dirt being chewed to pieces by crossfire. She remembered the faces of the boys in the riverbed. She could see them clearly. Private Miller, his face pale, clutching a shattered femur. Corporal Evans, trying to apply pressure to his own neck wound while holding his rifle with one hand. They were kids. They were someone's sons, trusting her to be the barrier between them and the abyss. There had been no conscious decision. There had been no weighing of odds. There was only duty. In the memories she broke from cover, the sound of her boots hitting the dirt was drowned out by the sudden, concentrated roar of enemy fire directing its fury toward her. She remembered the heat of a bullet snapping inches from her face, close enough to leave a phantom burn on her cheek. She reached the riverbed and slid down into the dirt. The smell of copper was overwhelming. Blood. So much blood. It was soaking into the parched earth, turning the sand into a dark, sticky paste. She worked with mechanical, terrifying efficiency. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, chest seals. Her hands moved autonomously, guided by thousands of hours of muscle memory. She remembered shielding Miller's body with her own as a mortar round impacted 20 feet away, the concussive force lifting her off the ground and raining sharp shrapnel down upon her Kevlar vest. She remembered ignoring the warm, wet sensation spreading down her own left shoulder, where a piece of jagged metal had found a gap in her armor. She stabilized them, but stabilization was not salvation. They had to move. She remembered dragging Evans. He was a farm boy from Iowa, built like a linebacker, and his dead weight tore at her muscles. She dragged him backward, her legs burning, her lungs screaming for oxygen in the thin, dusty air. She fired her sidearm blindly over her shoulder to keep the enemy heads down, the slide locking back empty just as she pulled him behind the mud wall. She went back for the second. She went back for the third. By the time the medevac chopper finally arrived, beating the air into a blinding sandstorm, she had held the line. She had loaded them onto the slick metal floor of the bird. She remembered the crew chief trying to pull her aboard, pointing frantically at the blood soaking her shoulder and chest. She had shoved his hand away, yelling over the deafening rotor wash that her team was still on the ground, taking fire. She had turned her back on the helicopter and ran back into the dust. Margaret opened her eyes. The gray walls of the holding cell returned. The harsh, fluorescent light replaced the blinding desert sun. The memory receded, leaving behind a cold sweat on her brow and a deep, aching phantom pain in her left shoulder. She looked down at her chest. The Medal of Honor rested quietly against the dark fabric of her suit. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, But Margaret knew its true nature. It was not gold and silk. It was a headstone. It was a tangible piece of the boys who had not made it onto the helicopter that day. It was the weight of a nation's grief and gratitude, distilled into a few ounces of metal. It was a sacred trust. Silas Hawthorne had called it costume jewelry. He had threatened a young man's life to force her to desecrate that trust. Margaret took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the smell of the holding cell. She felt no anger toward the judge. Anger was a useless emotion, a waste of tactical energy. She felt only a profound, unshakable resolve. Let him do his worst. She had survived the fires of hell. She would not be broken by a man who had never seen the match struck. 3 floors above, in a chamber paneled with imported mahogany and lined with leather-bound volumes of jurisprudence he rarely consulted, Judge Silas Hawthorne was pacing. The thick Persian rug muffled his footsteps, but his mind was a chaotic storm of bruised ego and rising panic. He poured himself a glass of water from a crystal carafe, his hand trembling slightly, causing the glass to clink against the rim. He drank it down, but it did nothing to cool the heat in his face. He had made a mistake. The realization was clawing at the edges of his arrogant mind, but his pride refused to fully let it in. He had expected the woman to fold. Everyone folded in his courtroom. The power of the bench was absolute, but the look in her eyes before the bailiff took her away, that cold, pitying stare, had unnerved him deeply. It was not the look of a frightened citizen. It was the look of an apex predator observing a noisy insect. Furthermore, he had seen the reaction of the gallery. He had seen the shock on the faces of the lawyers waiting their turn. Hawthorne was a creature of local politics. He knew that if this incident lingered, if local defense attorneys caught wind of an elderly veteran being jailed for wearing a medal, it could become a headache. The press might get involved. The State Judicial Review Board, already annoyed with his high overturn rate, might start asking uncomfortable questions. He needed to bury this. He needed to remove Margaret Abernathy from his jurisdiction before the local veteran networks or ambitious lawyers could file an emergency injunction. Hawthorne sat down at his massive desk. He pulled a blank transfer order form from a drawer. His pen hovered over the paper. By standard protocol, a person held in contempt would simply sit in the county jail downstairs for a few days until they apologized or a hearing was scheduled. But Hawthorne had discretionary power. He could claim she was a disruption to the facility, a security risk due to her uncooperative nature. He began to write. He filled out an expedited transfer order, mandating that Margaret Abernathy be moved immediately to the State Women's Correctional Facility in Chowchilla, a grueling 5-hour drive north. Once she was in the state system, isolated in a maximum security environment, far from the sympathetic eyes of local attorneys, she would break. She would sit in a crowded cell until she begged to apologize. By the time anyone figured out where she was, the lesson would be learned, and Hawthorne's absolute authority would be preserved. He signed his name with a violent flourish, the ink tearing slightly into the paper. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Call the transport division," Hawthorne snapped to his secretary. "I have an immediate transfer order. I want the prisoner from courtroom 4B on a secure transport bus heading north within the hour. No delays, no phone calls. Just get her out of my courthouse." He leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long breath. The problem was solved. The disruption was eliminated. Order, as he defined it, was restored. Back in courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was suffocating. The judge had declared a 30-minute recess to collect himself. The gallery was mostly empty, save for a few stunned civilians whispering to each other. Elias Thorne sat frozen at the defense table, his face buried in his hands, quietly sobbing. His life was over. The woman who had come to save him was in chains, and the judge was going to crucify him out of spite. At the clerk's desk, Thaddeus Winslow had not moved. He sat perfectly still, staring at the shattered pieces of his pen on the desk. Thaddeus was 78 years old. He had spent his entire life blending into the background. He was a creature of habit, a man who found comfort in the predictable rhythms of docket numbers, filing dates, and bureaucratic procedures. He avoided conflict. He kept his head down. He survived by being invisible. But Thaddeus was also a man who remembered. Before he was a hunched clerk with arthritis, he had been a young intelligence analyst in the United States Army. He had served in the freezing concrete bunkers of West Germany during the height of the Cold War. He had tracked Soviet troop movements. He understood the machinery of the military, the sacred chain of command, and the absolute, unyielding respect demanded by certain symbols. He had recognized the pale blue ribbon. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that Judge Hawthorne had just ordered the arrest of a Medal of Honor recipient for refusing to surrender her decoration. It was an act of such staggering ignorance and profound disrespect that it bordered on treason. Thaddeus looked up. He saw the bailiff return to the courtroom, looking pale and sick. The bailiff walked over to the clerk's desk and leaned in close. "Thaddeus," the bailiff whispered, his voice trembling. "The judge just sent down a signed order. He's putting her on a state transport. He's sending her to Chowchilla. Maximum security. They are loading the bus in 45 minutes. He's trying to disappear her." Thaddeus felt a cold shockwave travel down his spine. Chowchilla. They were going to strip a national hero of her dignity, throw her in a cage with hardened criminals, and bury her in the system. The injustice of it was a physical weight on his chest. Thaddeus looked at his trembling, knobby hands. He thought about his pension. He thought about his quiet life. If he interfered, Hawthorne would fire him instantly. He would lose his retirement. He would be cast out in his twilight years. He looked at Elias, the weeping sailor. He thought about the woman in the basement, sitting in the cold, holding the weight of the nation's honor in silent defiance. Thaddeus slowly closed the docket book. He stood up. His joints popped, a loud, dry sound in the quiet room. He did not look at the bailiff. He turned and walked out the side door of the courtroom, heading toward the rear archives. The archives room was a windowless vault filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of dusty legal boxes. It smelled of decaying paper and dead air. Thaddeus walked to the very back, past the records of decades-old property disputes and forgotten felonies. He reached a small, cluttered desk tucked into a corner, used only for sorting old files. He sat down heavily. He reached into his worn leather briefcase, a relic he had carried for 40 years. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely manage the brass clasps. He opened it and pulled out a small, black, leather-bound notebook. Its edges were frayed, the leather cracked with age. Thaddeus opened the notebook. The pages were filled with faded ink, names and numbers of people who were mostly dead or retired. He turned past the civilian contacts, past the old friends from the clerks' union. He stopped at a page near the back. There was a single telephone number written in sharp, precise block letters. There was no name attached to it, just the number and a routing code. 35 years ago, during the tense days following the fall of the Berlin Wall, Thaddeus had done a significant favor for a young, highly placed logistical officer in the Pentagon who was untangling a massive jurisdictional mess involving returning soldiers. As a token of extreme gratitude, the officer had given Thaddeus this number. "If the system ever truly breaks, Winslow," the officer had said, "if you ever see something that violates the core integrity of the uniform, and the civilian authorities are the ones holding the knife, you call this number. It bypasses the switchboards. It rings directly into the office of the Joint Chiefs Crisis Management Desk. Use it once. Use it only for God and country." Thaddeus had kept it. For over 3 decades, through wars and peace, he had never dialed it. It was a phantom lifeline to a world he had long left behind. He looked at the dusty landline phone sitting on the sorting desk. It was an old rotary model, still plugged into a secure county line. Thaddeus picked up the heavy receiver. The dial tone hummed in his ear, loud and demanding. He took a deep breath, his chest shuddering. He thought of the blue ribbon. He thought of the word jewelry. He put his trembling finger into the first hole of the rotary dial. He pulled it down. The mechanical clicking sound filled the small room. He dialed the routing code. Then he dialed the number. The line clicked. It did not ring. There was only a hollow, echoing hiss of static, the sound of a signal being routed through layers of encrypted satellites and secure underground cables. Suddenly, the static vanished. The silence on the line was profound, devoid of any background noise. "Command post," a voice answered. The voice was male, flat, devoid of any regional accent or emotion. It was the voice of professional vigilance. "Identify and authenticate." Thaddeus swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. "This is Thaddeus Winslow, former Army Intelligence, serial number 84 Bravo 9er27. I am calling from the San Diego County Courthouse." There was a pause. The sound of rapid typing echoed softly on the line. "Authentication confirmed, Mr. Winslow. State your emergency. You are on a restricted line." Thaddeus gripped the receiver so hard his knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes. "I am reporting an active, illegal detention of a United States military asset by a civilian judge." "Clarify asset status," the voice demanded, remaining perfectly calm. "Active duty or retired?" "Retired," Thaddeus said, "but it doesn't matter. The asset is a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor." The typing on the other end stopped instantly. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy. It was dangerous. "Repeat your last, Mr. Winslow," the voice said. And for the first time, a sliver of human tension bled through the professional facade. "You heard me," Thaddeus said, his voice finding a sudden, unexpected strength. He felt the years falling away. He was a soldier again, reporting a breach in the wire. "A civilian judge named Silas Hawthorne has arrested a female Medal of Honor recipient. He held her in contempt for refusing to remove her medal in his courtroom. He called it costume jewelry. He has her in handcuffs in the basement, and he just signed a retaliatory order to put her on a state prison transport to Chowchilla in less than 40 minutes. He is trying to bury her in the system." "Hold the line," the voice commanded. The line went dead with a click, placing Thaddeus on a secure hold. 2,000 miles away, in a subterranean, heavily guarded command center beneath the Pentagon, the atmosphere shifted from routine monitoring to an immediate, adrenaline-fueled spike. The duty officer, an Army colonel, ripped off his headset and stood up. "Get me the Pacific Fleet Command, now!" The colonel barked across the room to a communications specialist. "I need the base commander at Naval Base Coronado on a secure video link. We have a code red jurisdictional breach in San Diego. A civilian judge has incarcerated a Medal of Honor recipient and is attempting a forced transfer." The room erupted into coordinated chaos. Keyboards clattered, screens flashed. "Colonel," the communications specialist called out, his voice tight. "The base commander at Coronado is currently airborne, en route to Hawaii for a joint exercise. He is unreachable for the next 4 hours. The executive officer is off base handling a civilian casualty incident. The local command structure is temporarily fractured." The colonel cursed under his breath. The clock was ticking. If they put her on a state transport bus, she vanished into a bureaucratic black hole that would take days and an army of federal lawyers to untangle. They needed someone with absolute, unquestionable authority on the ground immediately. Someone who could walk into a civilian courthouse and drop a hammer so heavy the judge wouldn't know what hit him. "Check the VIP transit logs for the Southern California sector," the colonel ordered. "Who do we have in the area? Who is carrying stars?" The specialist's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Scanning. We have a couple of 1-stars at Camp Pendleton. Wait, sir." The specialist looked up, his eyes widening. "We have Admiral Harrison Blackwood. Commander, United States Pacific Fleet, 4 stars. He is currently conducting a surprise inspection at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado. He is less than 15 miles from the courthouse. The colonel didn't hesitate. Patch me through to his secure mobile detail. Override all protocols. Put it directly into the Admiral's ear. 10 miles south of the courthouse, the salt air was thick over the Naval Amphibious Base. Admiral Harrison Blackwood stood on the edge of the grinder, the massive asphalt training parade deck, watching a class of SEAL candidates suffer through log PT. Admiral Blackwood was a legend in the Navy. He was a man carved from granite, with eyes as cold and deep as the Mariana Trench. He wore his 4 stars not as a political achievement, but as a heavy mantle of responsibility for the thousands of lives under his command. He was a combat veteran, a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of war. He despised bureaucracy. He despised politicians. He revered the warrior. His aide-de-camp, a sharp young lieutenant commander, stood a respectful 2 paces behind him, holding a secure, encrypted tablet. Suddenly, the earpiece in the aide's ear chirped with a priority override tone. The aide listened for 5 seconds. His face drained of color. He stepped forward, breaking protocol, and interrupted the Admiral's observation. "Admiral," the aide said, his voice low and urgent, "we have an immediate flash traffic from the Pentagon crisis desk. It requires your personal intervention." Blackwood did not take his eyes off the SEAL candidates. "What is it?" "Sir, a civilian judge at the county courthouse downtown has ordered the arrest of a retired service member. They have her in holding and are attempting to load her onto a state prison transport in 30 minutes to bury her in the penal system." Blackwood turned his head slightly, and irritation flickered in his jaw. "Why is the Pentagon bothering me with a local police matter? Let JAG handle it." "Sir," the aide swallowed hard, "the veteran was held in contempt for refusing to take off her decoration. The judge called it a distraction." Blackwood fully turned around now. He faced his aide, his towering frame blocking the sun. A dangerous stillness settled over him. "What decoration?" The aide looked at the tablet. "The Medal of Honor, sir." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Blackwood's eyes narrowed to microscopic slits. The temperature around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. The sounds of the training candidates shouting in the distance faded away. "Who is the recipient?" Blackwood asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the force of an approaching hurricane. The aide checked the data streaming onto his screen. The name provided by the informant is Senior Chief Margaret Abernathy, Navy Corpsman, retired. For a fraction of a second, Admiral Harrison Blackwood stopped breathing. He knew that name. He didn't just know it from a history book. 15 years ago, as a 2-star rear admiral commanding a carrier strike group in the Arabian Sea, he had read the raw, blood-soaked after-action reports from a catastrophic ambush in a nameless valley. He had read the accounts of a lone female corpsman who had charged into a kill zone 3 separate times to pull dying Marines from the fire, taking shrapnel and a gunshot wound in the process. He had read the testimonies of the survivors, who spoke of her not as a medic, but as an avenging angel. Harrison Blackwood had been the first flag officer to sign the recommendation for her Medal of Honor. He had stood in the White House when the president draped the blue ribbon around her neck. He knew the cost of that medal. He knew the ghosts that haunted the woman who wore it. And now some arrogant, sheltered politician in a black robe had put her in chains and was trying to throw her onto a prison bus like a common thief. The fury that ignited inside Admiral Blackwood was not hot and loud. It was cold, silent, and terrifyingly absolute. It was the wrath of an institution moving to protect its most sacred blood. "Get my vehicle," Blackwood commanded. His voice was no longer human. It was the sound of a steel bulkhead sealing shut. "Sir, your security detail," the aide began. "I said, get my vehicle," Blackwood roared, a sudden explosive sound that caused the SEAL instructors 50 yards away to turn their heads in shock. I want my dress whites brought to the SUV. I want the base judge advocate general in the car with me. I want a full Marine Corps Honor Guard detail assembled and following us in tactical vehicles within 5 minutes. We are going to the county courthouse. The aide scrambled, barking orders into his headset, sprinting toward the line of black government SUVs parked near the headquarters building. Admiral Blackwood stood alone for a moment on the edge of the grinder. He looked toward the north, toward the city skyline where the courthouse stood. The civilian authorities believed they had absolute power in their concrete boxes. They believed their gavels were the ultimate weapon. They were about to learn that there was a higher law, a law written in blood, bound by honor, and enforced by the full, crushing weight of the United States military. Blackwood strode toward his vehicle, his jaw set like stone. He was not going to negotiate. He was not going to file an appeal. He was going to walk into that courthouse, and he was going to tear the arrogant judge's world apart. Back in the dusty archives room, Thaddeus Winslow held the heavy rotary phone to his ear. Mr. Winslow, the flat voice of the Pentagon duty officer, returned. Yes, Thaddeus breathed. The situation has been escalated. You have an asset inbound to your location. Commander, Pacific Fleet has assumed direct tactical control of the incident. ETA is 12 minutes. Thaddeus felt a tear slide down his cheek. He let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. What should I do? The voice on the other end softened, just a fraction. You hold your ground, soldier, and you make sure that transport bus does not leave the loading dock. The cavalry is coming. Thaddeus hung up the phone. He stood up. His arthritis didn't seem to hurt anymore. He walked out of the archives room, his posture straighter than it had been in 30 years. He walked past his desk in the courtroom. He ignored the bailiff. He walked straight out into the hallway and headed for the service elevator. He was going to the basement. He was going to stand in front of a heavily armored prison bus if he had to. Margaret Abernathy had held the line in the desert. Thaddeus Winslow was going to hold the line in the concrete. The subterranean loading dock of the San Diego County Courthouse was a cavern of concrete and despair. It was lit by caged sodium bulbs that cast a sickly, jaundiced yellow glow over the stained asphalt. The air was thick and unbreathable, choked with the acrid metallic fumes of diesel exhaust from the idling state transport bus. The vehicle was a hulking mass of reinforced steel, its windows covered by heavy iron grates, its engine a low, vibrating growl that vibrated through the soles of the feet. It was a mechanical beast designed to swallow the forgotten and transport them to the desolate, concrete warehouses of the California penal system. Thaddeus Winslow stepped off the service elevator into this purgatory. His breath was ragged. His old heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The 78-year-old clerk looked entirely out of place in the grim, subterranean staging area. He stood near the massive steel roll-up doors that led to the street alleyway, his thin hands balled into fists inside the pockets of his faded cardigan. He positioned himself directly in the path of the bus. He was a fragile, aging man, but in his mind, he was standing watch on the Fulda Gap. He would not move. A heavy steel door at the far end of the dock clanged open. 2 county deputies emerged, flanking Margaret Abernathy. Thaddeus felt a sharp ache in his throat. Even here, amidst the diesel fumes and the grime, she was magnificent. The handcuffs still bound her wrists in front of her, the silver chain catching the yellow light. Her charcoal suit was slightly rumpled from her time in the holding cell, but her posture remained absolute. Her chin was level. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, focused on an invisible horizon that only she could see. She walked with the steady, measured cadence of a soldier on a long march. Resting against her chest, contrasting sharply with the bleak surroundings, the Medal of Honor gleamed. The 5-pointed star of solid gold seemed to pull the meager light of the basement toward it. The pale blue ribbon was a slash of sky in a sunless room. The deputies guided her toward the rear doors of the transport bus. Other prisoners, clad in bright orange jumpsuits, were already being loaded, their faces pressed against the wire mesh windows watching the impeccably dressed older woman with silent, confused reverence. "Hold the transport," the voice cut through the low rumble of the diesel engine. It was sharp, aristocratic, and dripping with venom. From a private, keycard-operated elevator, reserved exclusively for the judiciary, Judge Silas Hawthorne stepped onto the loading dock. He had not been able to stay in his chambers. The memory of Margaret's calm, pitying stare had gnawed at his ego like a physical parasite. He needed to see her load onto the bus. He needed to witness the exact moment her spirit broke. He needed the visual confirmation of his absolute supremacy. Hawthorne walked across the asphalt, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply. The deputies paused, looking at the judge in surprise. It was highly irregular for a presiding judge to oversee a routine prisoner transfer in the basement. "Judge Hawthorne," the senior deputy said, touching the brim of his hat, "we are preparing to load the prisoner for the Chowchilla transport, as ordered." Hawthorne stopped a few feet from Margaret. He looked her up and down. He searched her face for fear, for regret, for the tears of a broken woman. He found nothing. Her gray eyes met his with the same terrifying, empty calm. She looked at him not as a judge, but as an obstacle she had already mentally bypassed. "Before she boards," Hawthorne commanded, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, "confiscate the contraband." The deputy blinked, confused. "Contraband, Your Honor?" She was thoroughly searched at booking. "Belt, shoelaces, personal effects have all been bagged." Hawthorne pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Margaret's chest. "The necklace. I ordered it removed in my courtroom. She defied me. It is evidence of her direct contempt. It will be cataloged and held in the county evidence locker. Strip it from her neck." The senior deputy hesitated. He looked at Margaret, then down at the medal. A deep, instinctual dread pooled in his stomach. He had served in the National Guard. He wasn't entirely sure of the specific decoration, but the reverence with which the woman wore it, the sheer weight of its design, told him it was not a piece of costume jewelry. "Your Honor," the deputy started, his voice lowering respectfully. "With all due respect, taking personal property right before a state transfer. The paperwork is already sealed. And sir, I believe that might be a military award." Hawthorne's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He stepped forward, invading the deputy's personal space. "I do not care if she bought it at a carnival," Hawthorne spat, the veneer of his judicial composure finally shattering. "I gave a lawful order. She is a prisoner of this county. She does not dictate the terms of her incarceration."